Hi, welcome to this taster lecture for the Incentivising Innovation course. My name is Robert Burrell. I'm the Professor of Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law at the University of Oxford and one of 4 full-time staff that focus on intellectual property and related areas. So just a couple of things by way of basic introduction. So the Incentivising Innovation course is a half option on the BCL MDure program, but it's also available to MLF students. So what do we do on the Incentivising Innovation course and why might it be interesting? Well, the background to the course is that innovation policy is in a state of flux. And we can see that most immediately as a consequence of the pandemic. And the pandemic has thrust the potential role of the state as a driver of scientific innovation onto centre stage. Vaccines have been developed and brought to market in a timescale that seemed more or less impossible when the crisis first struck. And a number of commentators, including Joseph Stiglitz, have emphasised the role of government in the progress that we've made. So it was government investment that really underpinned the rapid development and rollout of vaccines. And the success of the state, or the role of the state in driving the development and rollout of vaccines, has added to calls for greater use of a mission-oriented approach to innovation policy. So in other words, that's an approach whereby the state sets out certain innovation goals, and then it's really the state that drives progress towards the achievement of those goals. And Mariana Mazzucato, in her most recent book, Mission Economy, has used the pandemic to argue that we really need a mission-oriented approach to innovation policy generally. But it's important to emphasize that it's not just the pandemic that's driving these calls for a different approach to innovation policy. The world is faced with other, what are sometimes called wicked problems. A problem that we've sort of largely sidelined during the pandemic is antimicrobial resistance. But in the period in which we've been living with the COVID pandemic, antimicrobial resistance killed something in the order of 1.16 million people. And by 2050, antimicrobial resistance is predicted to kill 10 million people a year, a number that would dwarf the number that have died from COVID thus far. And of course, above all, the real wicked problem that we face is climate change. And there's a suggestion that a mission-oriented approach is the way to deal with the existential threat that climate change poses. And so actually, when you sort of get into the field, you realize that calls for a greater use for a mission-oriented approach predate the pandemic. And I think it's important to acknowledge that they form part of a breakdown of the Washington Consensus and a general intellectual backlash against neoliberalism. So if you look even before the pandemic, in February 2020, Dominic Cummings was calling for the creation of a UK equivalent to DARPA. That's the US Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, which had a key role in developing things like the internet. Even early, if you go back to 2017, you see Innovation and Science Australia calling for a greater use of a mission-oriented approach, including through the rewriting of our public procurement rules. And that sort of brings on to the next point, is that these debates over the future of innovation policy have important legal implications. And so this course both examines the debates over future innovation policy and the legal implications of those debates. So, in other words, what would a shift in innovation policy mean for patent rights, for public procurement rules, for R&D tax credits and patent box regimes? So just to pause on those for a moment, we've already seen in the context of the pandemic a different approach to patent rights. Right at the beginning of the crisis, countries like Chile indicated a willingness to waive patent rules if necessary to increase access to COVID therapeutics. More recently, you will have probably seen in the press that South Africa and India are calling for a general TRIPS waiver for all patent rights over any technology that might be useful in the treatment or prevention of COVID. We've also seen public procurement rules being quietly rewritten during the pandemic. So the trend over the last few decades has been to treat public procurement as being concerned really solely with the creation of a market for government services. Whereas what we've seen during the pandemic, but what we also saw even prior to the pandemic, was a greater interest in using public procurement as a regulatory lever to encourage innovation in certain fields. And for example, the European Commission, long before the pandemic, had changed its approach to public procurement with a view to incentivizing innovation. We've also got ongoing arguments about whether R&D tax credits do anything positive for innovation, and some real arguments over patent box regime. So this is a tax rule to the effect that in many jurisdictions, including the UK, you pay a lower rate of corporation tax on income derived from patent royalties. If we are going to rethink our approach to innovation, might we also need to rethink our approach to corporate governance? One of the things that we'll be looking at on the course is whether there's anything to the argument that the current model of corporate governance encourages a focus on short-term returns for shareholders, and that focus comes at the expense of longer-term investment, including, of course, investment in innovation. So what we try and do on the course is to sort of link these big debates about innovation policy to a series of legal regimes. And we try and get you to think about the connections between the patent regime, tax credits, public procurement rules, corporate governance. So the idea is that by the end of the course, you'll be familiar with the central debates around innovation policy and the legal implications of these debates. You'll also understand what it means to think about innovation as a contested concept. So one of the things that we'll encounter is that we find people talking about innovation all the time, but actually there's actually quite a lot of scope for argument around what it means to talk about innovation. And we'll see why it's really important to avoid falling into the trap of equating innovation with that which can be patented. You'll also appreciate, contrary to the impression that some intellectual property courses or textbooks might leave you with, that we do not, and we have never relied on patents as the sole regulatory lever to incentivize innovation. You'll recognize the concerns that are often leveled at the patent system, the criticisms that are leveled at the patent system. So things like the role that patent trolls might have in disrupting innovation ecosystems, the problems associated with evergreening in industries like pharmaceuticals, so the applying for sequential patents so that the underlying invention never really falls into the public domain. But we'll also see that there are modern defenses of the patent system that emphasize the importance of patents for the dissemination of innovation rather than the creation. And that ties to some broader ideas that maybe we need to rethink what's difficult about innovation. One of Elon Musk's famous comments is that creating a prototype is easy, scaling that prototype up for a product that's marketable, that's the difficult bit. And that's not how we've generally thought about innovation. And maybe if the patent system has a key part in the creation of a marketable product, we need to actually be rather more cautious before we abandon the patent system or we sideline the patent system in favour of other regulatory levers that we might pull to incentivize innovation. So look, I hope that's given you some sense of what we cover in the course and why what we cover is important and why it connects with some broader themes around how we organise the relationship between the state and the market. And I look forward to seeing some of you when the course starts. Thank you very much.